Learn the basic gameplay for Kanata The First Sacrament in under 5 minutes. Let's begin with the basic setup. Start by placing your game board on the table. Then, place the beads on the properties. After that, place your barn, fences, all of your cards, abominations on top of the barn and behind the fence, possessed sheriff's car, roadblock standees, player boards with the tracking beads, the sand timer, your dice, the van and four-wheeler standees, the hanging corpse standees, and your player standees at the bed and breakfast. Now let's move on to the player's turn. Players will take up to 5 actions per turn using their player board. The player board provides players with various choices that can be made in any order, while also determining their fate on every turn. Here are the 5 actions of the player's turn. The green player actions are mandatory and must be taken by the player for every turn. The ones in gray are optional. The red unexplained actions are also mandatory, sheriff and abomination, and must be taken last. Move or stay. Choose either 1 or 2 dice to roll if you choose to move on the game board. The amount of dice you choose will also dictate what you will roll for the player board and the sheriff and abomination. If you decide to stay, you will need to roll 1 die for the player board and sheriff and abomination. Players can move in any direction on the game board, as long as they stay on the roads or pathways. Players can move any amount of spaces they choose up to the total dice roll. Player board. Starting on the barn space, players will move clockwise on the player board when they roll. When they either land on or past the barn space, an abomination will be released from the barn, and a threshold bead will be removed from the board. When all the threshold beads are removed from every player's board, the horde will be released from behind the fence, as well as the one from on top of the barn. Landing on a fence space indicates a safe space. Landing on an event card space indicates whether the player has to draw from either the exterior or interior event card deck, depending if they're inside a property or outside on a road or path. These card decks are filled with all types of interactions the player will have to deal with that range from unexplained phenomenon, demonic manifestations, and townfolk who may help or harm you, depending on their level of sanity. Shooting. This action allows players to use a weapon from their inventory. Each weapon card will show its ammo and range. To take out an abomination, the player must roll a 1 to get a headshot. To make the possessed sheriff car lose a turn, the player must roll an odd to take out a tire, which just reinflates after a turn. Searching. There are 14 properties players can land on and search for the 4 items needed to take down the hellish roadblock. They will also find weapons and health items during their search to help them with their escape. To search, a player must remove a bead and then draw from the search deck card pile. Once all beads have been removed from a property, this indicates it is now empty. Sheriff and Abomination. The player will always move for the possessed sheriff car and abomination as the last action, if there are any on the board. The possessed sheriff car can only drive on the road spaces and cannot enter a pathway or drive through a property. The possessed sheriff car will always go after the closest player on the road space. It will also drive up to the player who is on a path and stay as close as it can to the player using the road spaces. If all players are inside a property, the sheriff car will drive back to the roadblock to make sure no one leaves. If the sheriff car catches a player by landing on the same space, the player will lose all their inventory cards, which will be placed in the cornfield, and then be moved to the B&B. The sheriff will remain in the same space where they caught the player, and continue after the other players. The abomination will move the same way as the sheriff, except they can move along pathways as they can float and pass over properties. An abomination can only enter into a property to catch a player if it rolls an odd. Once an abomination catches a player, it turns the player into an abomination. Once a player is turned, they must flip their player board over and start using this. The order of actions are the exact same, with the exception to the sheriff and abomination, as they will not be moved by a turned player. Landing on one of the symbols will have the player roll a 4-sided die and carry out the action that is assigned to that number. Cooperative play is essential, and strategy is key if you want to survive and escape Kanata The First Sacrament. You can now follow us on Kickstarter.